What we're talking about this afternoon or tonight is a subject I think will interest everybody because we all enjoy festivities, right? Or most of us do anyway. A lot of us can find enjoyment with other people doing things that we can celebrate in common or that we can express appreciation for because of our association or familiarity or just a shared bond with someone or something. And typically these are times that are annual, right? I mean, there are times when just certain things may occur one time and you give honor to it. For example, like when someone passes away, we show up at their funeral, right? And we don't necessarily come back. Some people do. Some people come back and they visit the cemetery or wherever they're comfortable expressing their feelings about the departed. But it's not the same thing. It's not where everybody gathers together the same way they did the first time to fully honor and give their final goodbyes to someone who has died. Versus, say, a birthday, right? That's more of an annual celebration type, unless you don't think birthdays are something to celebrate, right? There are people, groups, and individuals who don't think birthdays are consistent, for example, with biblical principles. The kinds of things that on this channel, at least, we focus on primarily. I talk about a number of things because I'm like you and we do a lot of different things, but our focus, what I really try to concentrate on is how we can become better individuals and better as a religious community of people who believe in three very important things. At least most of us do. And those of us who don't agree on those three most important things, Jehovah is the one God, the Father. Jesus, the heavenly Son of God, who came to the earth, gave his life in fulfillment of Genesis 3 as the last Adam who was raised to life and who now lives eternally, the one who has the keys of death and Hades. In our belief, these are the texts, that we accept as accurate or in fulfillment of the things Jesus did and will do next. But the three things are Jehovah, Jesus, and how we treat each other, the golden rule. There are a lot of other things, and again, we don't even agree on those three entirely, except maybe the golden rule. We may find ourselves differing in its application at times, but I think it's overall a consistent principle that people can accept. The other two, we get caught up in terms of the Father being either a part of a modalistic God or a Trinitarian God or just the one God, the Father, who has sons of God, sons of his, some of whom follow him and whom he rewards, and others who rebel against him and whom he allows to do what they want until they're done. So we're in a position as the human sons and daughters of God. God made humans in his image, male and female. And so as humans who are made in the image of God, then, how should we respond down below? To what extent, if we accept that we believe in God and that we're Christian, or just people who believe in a God and accept that we're responsible for how we act, to what extent should we engage in things like celebrations, acknowledgments of people's birth or special events, anniversaries, right? These are things that people celebrate regularly, but that are not spelled out in the Bible as things we're supposed to do religiously or even socially, right? The Bible doesn't really outline anything but, festivals and days of special religious importance in terms of the Jews were following the Mosaic Law. And the reason why we don't typically point to those festivals as Christians and say, well, we do those festivals is because when Jesus fulfilled the law, it no longer became something we were required to do. And the thing is, the tricky thing with the law is it does tell us Jah's will, of course, things that are good for us to do and not do. But if we start to follow it to the extent of requiring others to do the things we believe should be done, We're following it and requiring others to follow it, and now we're no longer following Jesus Christ, the Son. That's always been the problem. That's the problem in Galatians, what Paul talks about when he had to confront Peter and others, because they were again going back to the law. Yeah, it was a good thing. Circumcision is a good thing. It wasn't necessary anymore. We'll read more about that later. But my point is that the law isn't really a source or a source for Christians to use and say, okay, these are the festivals we follow. We know that Jesus celebrated the Passover and replaced it by using the emblems of bread and wine to represent something different, right? His blood and his body, which at that point was going to be given up on behalf of our sins and in obedience to his Father. So he came and fulfilled Genesis 3 and undid what Adam had done and Eve. And so now we're in that sense spiritually as Christians given a new relationship with God by following Jesus and not the law, right? That's how they had their relationship with him before. Couldn't fulfill it completely. It still was Jah's law. Jesus did it entirely. Whereas Adam only had that one command, right? At that point, it was just the one command. Now, Jesus, of course, knew more. And so the law, being more, made more sense. And he fulfilled it. And it wasn't too much for him to complete, and he did it. But it was too much for everyone else. So that's the real dangers we're going to see further in some of the texts we're going to read. And I'll get to your questions as well. Someone let me know as well how the stream is. I always like to know how it's coming across to you. But what we're going to do is, as we often do here, we get right to the texts. That's the goal. The goal here, or what I try to do, is get you an understanding of these biblical texts and related texts that makes sense, right? Not just because it makes sense the way I put it together. I want to go through it and read it in the way that it was written and make sense of it together so that you see what I'm seeing and why. And that's the whole point of us, coming together. So I am glad to have you with me today. All right, let's get right to it. Let's talk about a text we've read. We're going to be strictly in the Bible today, several biblical texts, letters and documents, and mainly in the New Testament. Because as I said, the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Aramaic or Greek Septuagint text, of course, the Old Testament, I'm not going to go there because the second we go there, it gets us too close to where we no longer need to be. You can still do everything you want if you choose to in terms of the law. Just don't bring it up to me, right? That's not something you're supposed to be teaching other Christians or anybody, really. Not if you're following Jesus. Because that's going to put you right back to where you don't want to belong. Right? Being held accountable to the law. That's the whole point. But we're still accountable. So for what? What are we accountable? If not the law, not those festivals, those things. They still give us a glimpse into things Yahuwah likes, doesn't like. All right. So let's take a look at some of the things that his son taught, some of the basic teachings, like something right now that we're all familiar with. Matthew 7. Let's go there right now. I'll bring it up in my copy of the NWT. I'm going to use it because I haven't translated all texts. And even though I've translated many of the texts we're going to read today, I still felt I'd go ahead and use the NWT because I know a lot of you do. And it's easy for me to use and make sense of and discuss critically. So that's what we'll do. Go ahead and go to Matthew, or you can follow along with me. Matthew 7. We're just going to read a couple texts here. I want to, refresh our memory. I know we all know these texts. But when we go through material based on a subject like birthdays, holidays, festivals, and the Bible, there are certain things that are important for us to keep in mind that I think will help us as we go through different accounts. Basic principles, right? That you're going to see aren't just tucked away from these accounts we're going to read in more detail. They connect directly by the words that are used. Judge, judging, those concepts, what they mean. Matthew 7, 1 through 4. This is Jesus talking. He says, stop judging, that you may not be judged. For with what judgment you are judging, you will be judged, and with with the measure that you are measuring out, they will measure out to you. Why then do you look at the straw in your brother's eye, but do not consider the rafter, the small piece of wood in your brother's eye? You've got a giant piece of wood in your eye, and you're worried about the little piece of wood in someone else's eye. Well, you better get that big rafter out, the big piece out first. How can you say to your brother, allow me to extract the straw from your eye, when look, a rafter's in your own eye? Okay, and yet we know, right, this does not preclude people who genuinely see somebody with, if you see somebody with a small piece of wood in their eye, that's a problem, right? That's not insignificant. It's insignificant next to the large piece of wood, right? But a little piece of wood is a big deal. So it's okay if you don't have a piece of wood in your own eye that's equally or more so distracting, right? Get it out first so you can see clearly. You might push the small piece of wood, deeper into the other person's eye. You can't see clearly. But there's still a time when people who have a small splinter in their eye need help from people who can see clearly. That's what he says in the next verse, right? First extract the large piece of wood or the rafter, then you'll see clearly how to extract the straw from your brother's eye. Okay, so you don't just leave the person with the straw in their eye. But first, you deal with your own eye and make sure you see clearly. Otherwise, you're just going to make it worse for the other person. And if that's your goal, well, then none of this really matters to you. If your goal is to help the other person with the small piece of wood in their eye see clearly, then you should be worried about seeing clearly so you can help that person. Okay, now, oftentimes, as many of us know, there are groups, and specifically, I'm not going to get into details about the Watchtower, for example, Watchtower Society. They're known, for example, not celebrating holidays, birthdays. So they're different than many religious groups in that way, Christian religious groups. And I'm not going to get specifically off into their beliefs and practices or arguments against holidays and birthdays. I will a little, more so indirectly, or if you bring them up in the comments. But mainly, if you want to, mainly today I'm going to stick with just the biblical texts. And again, we'll indirectly refer to some of these things like I just did. But in connection with those kinds of groups, or specifically the Watchtower, often it will be said from some of their followers, representatives, that the Bible portrays certain events like birthdays negatively. So, for example, Herod's birthday in Mark 6, Herodias' daughter, who comes and dances before Herod, Herodias being Herod's brother's wife. Herod, in spite of other things and maybe his ability to command people, he totally gives way to her dancing and offers her half his kingdom, up to half his kingdom for a request. Maybe some hyperbole, but basically letting her know whatever you want, you'll get it next. So after consulting with her mother, who was offended by John the Baptist, she requests John's head, which is then brought to her on a platter. So the Watchtower, people who agree with them in that respect, will say, well, see, it's presented in a negative way in the Bible. And so that's why we don't celebrate birthdays. Birthdays are not presented in the right way in the Bible. And yet, the birthday is not what's really presented in a negative light, not directly. Not even being Herod's birthday. I mean, it's Herod's birthday, so the character of the person whose day you're celebrating, especially if they're the one who rules everything and everyone's eager to please, they're going to do what that person wants, unless that person wants to do what they want in the case of Herodias' daughter. Either way, what the one who rules wants is what's going to happen. So, is it really a fair comparison, I guess is what I'm getting at, to use Herod's birthday as a representation for how it's viewed. The Bible does not come out and say birthdays are not to be celebrated or they're not Jah's will. Nothing like that. Just that most you have this and other events with similar birthdays that are done where negative events occur. But not because of it being a birthday, it's just the people whose birthday it is are bad people. And so I don't know that that's a fair comparison. I don't think so anyway, myself. I'll leave it open to you. With someone who's not a quote-unquote bad person, right, who would murder someone on their birthday or anything close, where none of us are good in the fullest extent that we were supposed to be. But we're not all as bad either, right? We don't kill, most of us don't even come close to that. And so when you're making a comparison of events, you have to look at the people. If you're just comparing the event, it's just a birthday. Really what you're saying is that Herod's a bad person who did something on a day when something special was done to him. His birthday. Someone danced for him that entertained him, where she was put in a position to get something that, by influence of her wicked mother, ended up being bad. Not even something Herod was expecting, right? Although he did it. Terrible person. So, but that doesn't make the birthday bad. Because if it did, then you'd have to say that the other people who don't kill people on their birthday and who don't do anything bad in that way, wouldn't they then be a model for how birthdays are good? You can't just pick one example or two examples and say that's the template for every other birthday, right? If we're using special rulers and others who at times can give death sentences and choose to do so on their birthday, that's not really a comparison for people who celebrate their birthday in ways that they're being reminded of the time they came into the world and a part of that family. And the family is so happy to have that person. They remember it. They remember the time when the person became alive outside of the person who birthed them and part of the family. And as they grow older and become a part of the world around them. I don't see a comparison with someone like Herod. And so again, there's no reason to just use Herod or Pharaoh or anyone special like that's birthday and say, that's the template or model we have to follow now. No, the Bible doesn't do that. It just narrates those examples in ways where, because of those people, they do things that are not, of course, good. But then they're not the only examples of people who had birthdays, obviously. And so the Bible, absent an explicit declaration against birthdays, let's talk about an example in the Bible where a birthday is presented in a positive light. Luke chapter 2. Here, we'll be able to get to both the birthday and holiday aspects of today's, show theme. Birthdays, holidays. And you could also say it's not really a festival we're going to consider right here. But you could see why a festival wouldn't be too far removed from it. Let's take a look. Luke chapter 2. And, again, I told you I'm not going to pick on and I never pick on, even if I'm talking about someone, if I reference their belief or what they talk about, unless I do it wrongly, right? Unless I misrepresent it or just keep going and needlessly pick on someone where it's already clear. We're not establishing any further, anything we don't know. I get that, but I don't do that. So when I talk about the Watchtower, though, I'm laying context, whether it's for birthdays and the example I gave for Herod. And when it comes to things like Christmas, the Watchtower also fits. They're one of the more recognized Christian groups of people throughout the world that unitedly reject celebrating Christmas or Jesus' birth on any day, unless it's every day in the way they do everything else they do. They don't specifically single out Jesus' birth and celebrate it the way people do on Christmas. Right? Even if Christmas isn't Jesus' actual date of birth, and of course, right, that's a part of the Watchtower argument, right? Why would you celebrate a day on which you say Jesus was born, and the Bible, the evidence anyway, suggests that he was not born on that day. Well, whether he was born on that day or not, I don't think the people who are celebrating Christmas nowadays and historically have really ever said, well, maybe ever. Some people may have thought that or just believed it was true. But it's certainly not the case that everyone, emphatically states and claims and requires of others to believe that that's his true date of birth. Most people recognize that's sort of the accepted date of his birth because it doesn't give a date for his birth. Even if you accept it as in the spring or in the fall, it's not a date you're given. You'd have to maybe narrow it down through things like the priestly functions and descriptions of shepherds in the field, depending on how you look at that. Well, we're not going to get off on that too much in this show. Although I'll discuss it further if you have questions. But let's just read the text, right? Because, again, if someone were requiring you to believe December 25th is Jesus' birthday, and then it would be easy to show that that's not something a Christian should do, right? We don't, as we're going to see further in a moment, we're not supposed to be making rules for people to do or not do anything with regard to days or new moons or even Sabbath times that were specified in the law. And even when it comes to doing things like eating or drinking. And basically, according to the Christian law, we're not supposed to be getting involved in people's lives, period. Unless it's to help them praise God, Jah, by following the Messiah. And what did he do? He helped other people. We can help too. Sometimes people need different types of help. That's true. But that's what we should do. I think we just kind of treat everyone like they're exactly the same, and people should be being helped by people closer to them, so they know what the person is saying, what they're going through. We can provide certain basic principles, reminders, but people need to have certain connections within their community to help them through very difficult times. But when it comes to just going through life, right, deciding questions on what days to celebrate, right? This isn't supposed to be like the law. It's not supposed to be something where we feel like we're held accountable if we do or don't do something that we're not sure is right or wrong. There's these different arguments and questions. It's like our conscience can't even really settle on one. But if we're calm and we reflect on the evidence, I think it can. At times, though, right, it's like, well, I don't know what to do, so I won't do anything. It's almost like that one slave again with the one talent, right? And he just goes off, hides it, it's not sure what to do with it. And so there's not even the interest through the bank that the wicked bank would provide and give to the master. He can't even give him that. We don't want to be that slave. We don't want to be confused, not know what to do. We should be able to choose and then let other people choose. Or do we have to hold people accountable, right? Are these things that important? Birthdays, holidays, festivals. If they're that important, in what sense? Is it defined for us in the text? Luke chapter 2, let's see what it has to say about birthdays and holidays right here. Really the origin of the Christmas holiday. Luke chapter 2, I was in Luke chapter 7. And so we've already read how we're not supposed to be judging other people. What judgment we give will be given to us. So that's a warning, right? That's a clear warning, Matthew 7. Yet we also know at times that we're not supposed to approve of everything. We'll get to that text later on, right? We would be held accountable if we approved something that was wrong. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to condemn other people just because we think it's wrong, right? That's more of our own conscience, in our own conscience respect. And so we can't go against what we think is wrong, or otherwise it's a real sin, right? We know it's wrong, we do it anyway. So it's held accountable against us. That doesn't apply to every other person. Right? Only they would know that, only God. And so the less that we try to apply what we think is right, the less we can go wrong in that respect, right? They can still go wrong. We can still show by example and teaching what we think is right. But let me show you this. This is somewhat of a difficult problem, though, because, right, I mean, people, if you're like the Watchtower group, if you celebrate a birthday or a holiday, that's a red line. That's not just, oh, I can't believe you do that, or it's not, okay, fine. No, that's it. Okay, that's done and done, right? I mean, so it's a big deal, especially for that group and for others as well. So it makes people feel uncomfortable when it comes to things having to do directly with what they believe in most, or what in some sense they hold sacred. Luke chapter 2. Let's just read the text, right? I mean, so let's try to not get bothered by Christmas or these associations and what we've come to accept. I'm not telling you to disconnect from your beliefs or from the biblical text. I'm just asking you for a moment to look at it closer with me. Luke chapter 2, verses 6 through 20. Get my reading voice ready. I will get to your questions as well and take a look. Let me see if you guys have said anything at this point. Okay, good. Glad. I appreciate the comments so far. So I'll get back to the questions, in a little bit. But let's go through a few more of these texts together, because I like to, develop this theme a little further. We'll spend as much time as we need to make sure we have a clear understanding. But basically, we've already started out by pointing out what we already know, that as a Christian, we're not to judge other people. And yet, at the same time, if we don't make certain judgments, well, we could end up celebrating things like John's beheading, right? So we'd have to know what kind of person we're dealing with, or where we're going, what they're celebrating, who's involved. And there are judgments that are made that are not permanent, right? Herod, even though he gave that call, he let that happen, could he have changed? I mean, the way he's spoken of, right, doesn't seem likely. We cannot say. That's the whole point. As bad as he may seem, or anybody, we just have to make the judgment call of whether or not we want to go according to how they are right now. Okay, later, if they change later, maybe we'll come back and we'll go. Won't be such a problem. Herodias won't be there. Her daughter, okay, so things change. But we can make judgments that we need to make in order to make to stay safe, right? The judgments aren't always the wrong thing when viewed in that respect, according to what's happening. Not necessarily what's going to happen next. Well, sometimes next, of course, right? Like if you end up going to someone's birthday and they're corrupt, or they're someone who's going to do things that are not what you support. Well, then what next really does matter, right? What they do next at the birthday, like Herod. But I'm talking about next in terms of next in their future, right? We don't judge in those ways. We make judgments according to the things happening to us and to others, so that we're prepared for what's happening and what happens next, right? And later on down the future. But, we reserve the right for anybody like Herod or others to change their course in life. So we should never feel like we're prohibiting, even in our minds, other people from responding, because that would be wrong. That would be judging someone in a way that later on we might be held accountable to if we change. And so that's the measure that would be measured to us. Now, let's take that, though, as a guiding principle. We've talked about how birthdays are presented negatively, but that just because one birthday is bad or two birthdays are presented with people who are bad, that doesn't define every birthday. Those are just bad people doing bad things on birthdays. The birthday doesn't know, right? The birthday isn't bad or good. It's the person on that day, whose day it is or who's in control of what happens, who determines whether or not that day or what happens on that day is good in their own respect, right? And so that's how a birthday should be judged, according to really any fair logical application of principles that we use on a daily basis, right? We don't use one negative example as a measure for every single thing else, especially when the negative examples we have, people being killed on birthdays, are really not common. They're really not. Not even if they're part of some, primitive practice still ongoing, compared to the whole world, that would be considered an extremely rare birthday celebration practice, would it not? So why are we making decisions about birthdays being good or bad based on one or two accounts in the Bible? All right, let's go back to this one. This is another birthday text. Why aren't we making our birthday decisions about this one? This is the most important one. Luke 6, this is as they were coming up into Judea for the registration. And it says, this is Mary and Joseph in verse 6. It says, while they were there in Judea, the days came to the full for her, that is Mary, to give birth. And she gave birth to her son, the firstborn. And she bound him with cloth bands and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the lodging room. There was also in that same country shepherds living outdoors and keeping watches in the night over their flocks. And this is why sometimes groups like the Watchtower say that, December 25th isn't likely the time Jesus was born. Although, I wouldn't say this proves that definitively, but it does indicate a certain climate that may not have been the case at that time of year. Either way, let's just follow through with what it says. So far we're at the point where Joseph and Mary, she's about to give birth. They're in a manger. So we know, all these things that come about in different ornamentation and stories around Christmas time. And we have the shepherds living outdoors, keeping watches in the night over their flocks. And then verse 9, suddenly Jehovah's angel stood by them. There's going to be, in this text and in several other texts we'll get to later, and for example in Romans 14, where the NWT really uses the divine name a lot, apart from clear references or quotations from the Old Testament. And I don't agree with the use of the divine name in those texts. So at times I may supplant their use of the divine name with Lord, because there's really no basis for it. I may not do it every time, but those of you who know and who've read my writings on the divine name, and if you haven't, just get my JWD 1, 2, or 3 and read the chapter on the divine name, or go to my ElihuBooks.com topical index under D, divine name, and you'll see all kinds of links that'll give you information and help you understand why I agree and don't agree with some of the uses of the divine name in the New Testament. But when I use the NWT, I'm going to accept their rendering most of the time, except for when I qualify it now and say, okay, I may use Lord here, because it's just so obviously not connected with a direct reference or quotation. So in any case, whether I do or do not, keep that in mind. This isn't about the divine name, but it's important because it's going to happen like several times here and later. Focus on the issue though, right? The birthdays, holidays. So we have a birth and a holiday here, birthday and Christmas. What does the biblical text describe? Suddenly Jehovah's angel stood by them, that is by Mary and Joseph, in the manger, or the shepherds living outdoors and keeping watches in the night. And it says, and Jehovah's glory gleamed around them, and they became fearful. But the angel said to them, have no fear, for look, I am declaring to you good news of a great joy that all the people will have. And notice why. Verse 11, because there was born to you today, birthday, a Savior, who is Christ the Lord in David's city. Verse 12, and this is a sign for you. You will find an infant bound in cloth bands and lying in a manger. And so he's obviously appearing to the shepherds and those living outdoors. Verse 13, and suddenly there came to be with the angel a multitude of the heavenly army. Many angels doing what? On this birthday. This holiday, really, right? The first Christmas. It's a combination of the two, really. That angel and then a multitude of the heavenly army appear praising God. So what are they doing on this day, right? We talked about Herod and how on his birthday he had John beheaded, and how that's something used by the Watchtower, for example, to show that birthdays are portrayed negatively in the Bible, shouldn't be celebrated. Well, if that's the case, what about this birthday here, the one where Jesus is born? And angels appear. No one's being beheaded. No one's being killed at all. They're praising God. Verse 14, glory in the heights above to God, and upon earth peace among men of good will. Verse 15, so when the angels had departed from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to one another, let us by all means go clear to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us. And then actually a couple more verses here. We'll go down to verse 20. Verse 16, and they went with haste, the people living out in the fields, the shepherds, to whom the angels appeared, praising God, told them about the birth of Jesus, the Savior. So now they're going to Bethlehem. They went with haste and found Mary as well as Joseph and the infant, Jesus, lying in the manger. When they saw it, they made known the saying that had been spoken to them concerning this young child. So they told Mary and Joseph what the angels told them. And all that heard marveled over the things told them by the shepherds. But Mary began to preserve all these things, all these sayings, drawing conclusions in her heart. Verse 20, our last verse in this context. Then the shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all the things they heard and saw, just as these had been told them. I can't think of a much better way, right? Especially as a Christian. I mean, here as humans, we plan things and do things that are not as, that aren't based around being in these conditions, right? In a manger or even in the field, different setting. Nonetheless, in their location and according to this time and circumstance, everything related to the announcement of the birth of this child, the actual birth, this day, was a good thing. I mean, the best thing, right? Praising God, Savior, goodwill. So this account here surely is more important for Christians to follow when it comes, if you're going to use what the Bible describes as a birthday and how it describes it as a model. Why would we use Herod's birthday and the things he chose to do rather than Jesus' birthday and the things that those to whom the angels appeared chose to do? I'm open to any reasoning as to why we would be guided by one or the other one versus this one. Surely the Herod account tells us things we should avoid, right? I mean, we get that, but the birthdays aren't the problem. It's what happens on them. Who's involved? What are we supporting? What are we doing next, right? Not necessarily down the line. What kind of judgments can we conclude that are going to happen based on this event? And here they had to go back to Bethlehem based on what the angels told them. Found Mary and Joseph and the infant just as they were told. What did they do next? Began praising God. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, there's everything right with it, right? I mean, so it's like it's gotten us to the point where we've taken something right and thought of it as wrong, and it's supposed to be right. So we're not only wrong, we're supposed to be right in doing these things the way they're described. This is both a birthday and Christmas time. Whatever time. No one says you have to pick December 25th, but I will tell you this. If most people in the world are thinking of December 25th as Jesus' birthday, wouldn't it be more likely that you as a Christian would be more effective, regardless of whether you think that's the actual date, to talk to someone on December 25th about Jesus and these things, then undermine their confidence in his birth at all by telling them that's not the day? That's the first thing you want to talk to them about? You better follow it up quick with something more important then, right? Because there's really, if that's what people are able to do, people who don't believe, I mean, right? They're not people who are trying to really follow more diligently because they have other interests or they don't care. But December 25th comes around and now it brings it out. They become more friendly, more open. They start to care. They actually buy things for people. What are we taught as Christians? It's better to give than to receive. More happiness in giving than receiving. They actually start acting like Christians in that way, whether they think of it that way or not. And we're going to try to stop them because we think that's not the day that this happened in Luke 2. Well, then, are you prepared to give them a day to celebrate this? Or are you just so against this in Luke 2, praising God on this day? Right? Is not the way we treat others the golden rule that shows that we're following God and His Son? So it's not giving and receiving in the same vein that He taught us to, following His Son, following God? Well, okay, some may say it has associations. It has non-Christian associations with these Roman and other festivals and celebrations. And so they've taken what the Bible describes, even in Luke 2, and they've given it this day. It's the birth of the sun god, or it's just not true. And so we don't want to associate what's not true with what is true. Okay, but that would go back to whether or not people are actually believing or thinking or saying or requiring you to believe it's true, right? Because then what you're saying is not true. Because they're not saying it is true. They're saying that's just the day they've chosen on which to do the same things that these people chose to do. But is it the same thing? So you may still be wondering, okay, I see what you're saying here. They may just want to use that day. There's still some association with these other non-Christian celebrations and days. What are we to do? Do we have a clear vision, right? Do we know what to do? Or is that what we're left with? Let's go to another account. James chapter 4. Let's go here and read just a couple texts. James chapter 4. I'm going to look at your questions too in a minute. And of course, see if you have any that are related to the material or some of the related subjects like the Watchtower's views. I'll talk about them if you have questions. Otherwise, I would recommend, if you want more information specifically about the Watchtower's views on holidays and birthdays and celebrations like that, anniversaries, I do discuss that in my third dissertation of 3 dissertations, which you can get from Elihu Books. I'll put a link in the description. It's available on paperback. Eventually, I'll make it available in digital form, but I'm not sure when yet. So paperback's your only option at this point. But it's got some good information, references, and discussion of some of these texts. And I've also written other articles that I'll put in the description as well, where I talk a little bit about some holidays specifically. All right, but let's go to James chapter 4. So we've talked about birthdays, specifically Herod's birthday, Jesus' birthday, holidays, specifically Christmas. All right, we kind of had a 2-in-1 there. That's why I chose those texts. And then now James chapter 4. Let's see what it has to say. All right, so we read earlier about the do not be judging. That's how we're going to be judged. We know that really means that the next future, right, judgment. We're not to condemn anyone. We do have to make certain judgments about what we're to do, whether or not a person would be someone we'd want to do something with, right, like Herod or Herodias or her daughter. Excuse me. And sometimes we don't make the right decisions when it comes to those things. However, we can make the decision right the next time or the next time. We are not to give up on each other. And that seems like is what happens a lot. Notice James 4:11. Quit speaking against one another, brothers. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against law and judges law. Now, if you judge law, you are not a doer of law, but a judge. Verse 12, one there is that is lawgiver and judge. He who is able to save and to destroy. But you, who are you to be judging your neighbor? Right? We can't do this or this. So why are we doing this? You see his point? I know it's easy to do because, again, we do have to make some judgments, right? We do have to make decisions about things and people. Just not to the extent that we allow our own positions to be their positions. You see the difference? If I'm with a group of people and they decide they want to smoke, let's say a group, I'm with two other people and they want to smoke cigarettes. I may have been with them talking or doing certain activities, but then because of the close proximity with which they do their activity and the fact that I'm one of the three, let's say there's two, and so, obviously they would want to do their shared activity together absent me. I wouldn't impose my preference about smoking on the two smokers, right? I would just leave and then either come back when they're done smoking or meet up with them another time if that's what I want to do. That's the same thing. We can still have our own decision, and we should, right? We're accountable. We're the ones who are going to have to answer for what we choose to do. But that doesn't mean other people have to choose to do what we choose to do. Sometimes it makes it hard, right? Maybe I can't keep hanging out or being with or do certain things with the other two that do things I don't like. Well, that's just the way it is. So to certain extents, we will be involved with people, and to certain extents, we will not. It's when we begin to think less of the people we don't get involved with when it comes to certain things, unless it's, obviously, we're not talking about criminal or bad behavior, right? Behavior that someone is doing to other people that they wouldn't want done to them. That's a whole different deal. We're talking about decisions we make about things we enjoy in life. Birthdays, holidays, festivals. Well, Herod chose his birthday, had a young dancer who was connected with the woman that wanted to execute a prominent Christian man. And Herod said yes. At Jesus' birth, angels appeared, inspired shepherds in the field, all of whom, along with the angels, praised God and told everyone what had happened next. So, when it comes to the choices we make, evaluation of what's going on, the people involved, critical. But is it critical for us also to evaluate the thing going on, right? So far, there's really nothing that's been said about birthdays specifically that characterizes them as bad all the time. There's just different people who have them and do different things on them. And I would argue that we should be following the one example we're closest to, not the one we're farthest removed from. And even then, it's not for me to say what you do. My point is, there's nothing that says what we're supposed to do as far as having to do birthdays, right? Or not do birthdays. It's not brought up in that context. There are indications of things like I'm pointing to in Luke 2, and then principles in general like in James and Matthew 7. Right? We're not to judge, leave that to God. Is there anything more clear, more specific? I think there is. Let's go to Colossians 2. Colossians 2. All right, so we've talked from example and from principle, not judging. Herod's birthday, Jesus' birthday being the two examples. Let's look at Colossians 2. Went a little too far there. All right, here we go. Colossians 2. We're going to read verses 11 through 17. Follow along with me. This is really good. And gets right to the heart of specific days and festivals in general, but by inclusion, times when people are doing things. Colossians 2, verse 11, by relationship with him, you were also circumcised with a circumcision performed without hands, by the stripping off of the body of the flesh, by the circumcision that belongs to the Christ. For you were buried with him in his baptism, and by relationship with him you were also raised up together through your faith in the operation of God who raised him up from the dead. So these two texts, along with Romans 2, we might go there in a moment, but most of us know Romans 2, where it says Christians are not Jews by circumcision of the flesh as they were under the Mosaic law, but by circumcision of the heart, which is not something you or I can view. It goes on to say that that's something for God to judge. Ultimately, we make determinations based on what we can see. Can you see someone's circumcision of the heart? Maybe by their fruit, but not fully. That's why we read in James, we're not to judge our brother or anyone in that way, like Matthew 7 says. Verse 13, Colossians 2, furthermore, though you were dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcised state of your flesh, God made you alive together with him. He kindly forgave us all our trespasses and blotted out the handwritten document against us. This is what I talked about at the beginning of the show, how we're not, even though we know about the law, we have the law, we can see the festivals and days that were celebrated in the law. Well, we don't do that today. Why not? It's Yahuwah's law, is it not? Is it not what Moses and millions over time of other followers of Yahuwah did? Because we're not accountable to that law. And if we do try to live by it, the danger we have is losing the value of this circumcision, the one that belongs to Christ. So it's not that it has no value. It's just that, like our own opinion, we're not supposed to be imposing it on other people. Because once we do that, we're held accountable to it, right? Whatever judgment you judge, you're judged by. Well, if we make people accountable to the law, even the festival part, we're accountable by the whole thing, right? Because we can't just take the festival part out and say that's what we should follow. It's in the law. Okay, well, so is all this other stuff. So as soon as you try to force people or even use in any influential way the law as a basis for establishing the festivals we're required to celebrate, you're accountable for the whole law. Because there's nothing that allows you to only segregate the festival part. Fortunately, we're not accountable to it. You can still celebrate it, you see? You can still have your opinion. You just can't take other people's opinions. Sorry, let people have their opinion. It's hard, I know. We've all grown up to some extent with this desire to judge other people because we care, I think, ultimately, right? We think we're right and we want other people to be better. But what we don't realize is not everything we think is better is what other people think is better for them. So we need to be able to look past almost everything, or we're going to fall into this pattern of judgment. That's why I narrow it down to 3 things, right? And even that, even with 3, right? Even Yahuwah God, the Father, one God, Trinity, modalism. I mean, they can't even accept that. Right? By they, I mean others who don't agree, right? Even that is something we have to argue with on a high level. The Messiah, right? Trinity, Sabellianism. These different isms, right? We just read the text, right? He's Son of God, came from heaven to earth, lived as a man, resurrected as a life-giving spirit, done. Next, right? We don't have to get caught up into this endless debate and argument. You can. Oh, boy, I know you can. Why? Trust me, I'm qualified to tell you I know you can, and I'm also qualified to ask why, because I no longer do or try. Okay, so that's why I brought that up earlier, and the difference, and why it's dangerous for us to get caught up into using the Old Testament as a basis for what we or others should celebrate. Okay, all right, let's get back to where I was reading. I think I left off in verse 14, and we're going to read through 17. Okay. So verse 14, and blotted out the handwritten document against us, which consisted of decrees and which was in opposition to us. And he has taken it out of the way by nailing it to the torture stake or cross, depending on which text you're reading. Verse 15, stripping the governments and the authorities bare, he, that is God, exhibited them in open public as conquered, leading them in a triumphal procession by means of it. Therefore, let no man judge you. He's talking about the execution of his son. How, even though that might have seemed humiliating, that actually was so glorious. It's like a triumph procession, the ones held by Rome, in the sense that it delivered people from being condemned through the law, no longer having to follow it. And so with that, this is the setup. I'm reading this for a purpose, of course. I always want to give context, but this is all for a connection to what's next. Therefore, verse 16, because of all this, because of the relationship that we have now through the sacrifice of Jesus, not through the law, because of all that, therefore let no man judge you in eating and drinking or in respect of a festival or of an observance of the new moon or of a Sabbath. For those things are a shadow of the things to come, but the reality belongs to the Christ. Okay, and that's all we need to read as far as this account here. But what's most important, so the context, of course, leading up to it. But notice here, the judging that we read about in Matthew 7 and James 4, that were kind of in general, here are specifically applied to several things: eating and drinking, okay, a festival, observance of a new moon, or of a Sabbath. That's a lot. So festivals. Obviously, a lot of this has context in the Mosaic Law, like with Sabbaths. And they were still at times participating in them. That's what they knew. That's what other people who knew the Jews knew about them and their religion. So Paul is saying, if you want to do that, just like I was saying, no one's supposed to be judging you. But then doesn't that mean as well that they're not supposed to be judging anybody else? It's not just no one's judging you. It also means we don't judge anyone else when it comes to what they eat or drink, a festival, a new moon, a Sabbath. So we are told specifically as Christians, if you claim to follow these texts as a reliable basis for what Christians do next, you are not to be judging people when it comes to festivals, new moons, Sabbaths, eating or drinking. Well, you might say, well, Greg, what if someone invites you to a festival and they kill someone? I would say, well, if it's unexpected, like I went there because I thought the person was nice or nothing like that would happen and it just happened, it's a festival I still would go to, but something bad happened. It's the killing that's bad, or presumably in this scenario. Now, let's say I got tricked into going to a festival where murder was like a part of the festival. That's different, right? I didn't know it was I didn't know. I better know, right? Hopefully you know. But if something bad happens at an event that you don't expect, that does not characterize the event. Even John's beheading, right? That wasn't expected. Most people, if not everyone, maybe Herodias was hoping, something like that would happen. Most people were not expecting John to be killed, right? So we have to be careful not to characterize an event, a day, a festival because of what happens at that festival or on that day if it's not a part of that day or festival. Only if it's like let's say there was a child sacrifice festival, right? Festival of Baal. If the festival is set up for the purpose of doing something bad, the something bad is what controls. And so the festival is bad as a result. But that's not what we're talking about. People aren't celebrating Christmas or birthdays with the idea in their mind that they're doing something bad. If anything, right? As I said, usually on those days, people are giving to other people. Or if you're the one receiving, on Christmas, it's mutual. Usually, it can be. Birthdays, usually one gets it because it's their birthday, right? And then on other people's birthday, they give them something if that's a part of the tradition from in where you live. The Bible doesn't tell us either way, good or bad. It says some people were beheaded on a birthday. It says the Savior of the world was born on a day when people praise God because he was born. All right, so some people praised the date of Herod's birth in a horrible way. Other people praised the date of Jesus' birth in a great way. Well, what's wrong with the great way? Why is the great way being ignored and the horrible way being used as an example for why that day is always bad? Doesn't follow. Certainly doesn't follow logically. And it's not even something that, in terms of the text, should be seen as a priority for Christians in terms of our religion, right? We don't look to Herod. We don't look to what happened on Herod's birthday. We look to Jesus. We look to what happened on his birthday. Looked like people were pretty happy, praising God with the angels, telling other people. And as we know, there are other accounts where people bring him gifts, gold, frankincense. So these aren't rejected. Mary and Joseph didn't throw those gifts away. We don't take these back, you magi. They understood the connection between the honor that was being given and the demeanor being shown, no matter who the people were, to their son, the sent forth one. If you can't find a reason to celebrate with others on that day, well, maybe you should try. Maybe it'll take you some time, I know. Because if you've been brought up around people or with others that just think of it in very negative terms, you're going to think of it like it's Herod's birthday. But it's not. And people aren't supposed to be judging you where it concerns a festival or eating or drinking or new moons or Sabbaths. You might say, well, yeah, okay, that can include Christmas and birthdays. And I see your point about Luke chapter 2. That's presented in a good light. Is there anything else? Is there anything else we can use to really, further define the answer to the question of how birthdays, holidays, and festivals are presented in the Bible, specifically the New Testament? Because as we've been discussing, even though you can use the Old Testament and celebrate whatever you want, even a Sabbath, right? Colossians 2:16. I'm not going to judge you. Don't judge me. And don't try to get me to follow your view if I don't want to. That's not what it's about. All right, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We'll read a couple sections from 1 Corinthians. And then we'll conclude with Romans. I'll see if I can look at your questions. In fact, let's take a look. 1 Corinthians 4. Let me take a look over there. Looks like you guys are having a good time right there. All right. Let me see if I can get a good idea of what we may have on the table here. All right. Well, we'll take a look at some of the chat a little bit later on. Looks like people are exchanging some good thoughts and ideas. So let's get back to the text, though. 1 Corinthians 4, 3 through 6. Now to me, it is a very trivial matter. Listen to this. This is one you probably haven't thought of in this light. Now to me, it is a very trivial matter that I should be examined by you or by a human tribunal. Even I do not examine myself. For I am not conscious of anything against myself. Yet by this I am not proved righteous. But he that examines me is the Lord. This is one of those places where I said I might just use the Lord, because I don't think the divine name really fits here. Either way, notice this before we read the rest of the account, or the next couple verses anyway. He says he's not conscious of anything against himself. Okay, so he's at this point he's talking about, right? Right now, he's not conscious of anything against himself. He's past what he did against the Christians and all that stuff. And even in spite of that, he says, yet by this, after even being appeared to by Jesus, we read the account in our discussion about the resurrection body, even by this, that is his awareness that doesn't have anything against himself, he's not proved righteous. Okay, so what's he saying there? He's saying, that's why he said, I don't even look at myself, because even though I'm not conscious of anything, it doesn't prove anything. What's the point of me examining myself if it's Jehovah who judges me? Right? I'm not my own judge. He's not saying don't be aware of what you're doing. He's saying in a judgmental sense. Right? Look at verse 5. Hence, do not judge anything before the due time. So he's saying, I don't even judge. I don't even judge myself. And even though I'm not conscious against anything myself, it won't do me any good. It doesn't prove me righteous. Why? It's Jehovah. He knows. He knows me better than I do. So why are we worrying about other people? If we're using Paul, if we accept him as a guide in a sense, and he's saying, I don't even examine myself because that's not going to matter, why are we judging other people when we can't even get ourselves right? Again, we're not talking about people obviously in need or in peril. We're talking about judging people for the things they choose to do. And they're not in peril. It's just what they choose to do. We may not agree. We have reasons why. But that doesn't mean they do the same thing we choose to do. That's what he's talking about. Do not judge anything before the due time until the Lord comes, who will bring both the secret things of darkness to light and make the counsels of the hearts manifest. Then each one will have his praise come to him from God, not from us. We're not supposed to make people feel like they have to please us in that way. They either do or they don't. We associate with those who we get along with, and we don't with those we don't get along with. It was the same with them. Last verse, now brothers, these things I've transferred so as to apply to myself and Apollos for your good, that in our case you may learn the rule. Do not go beyond the things that are written, in order that you may not be puffed up individually in favor of one against the other. Okay, anything that pits you against another or makes you favor one against another, even you Watchtower witnesses, and you favor the governing body against others, you're not supposed to do that. No favor. And you're not supposed to go beyond the things written. When you do that, you get puffed up and you do give favor. Because you're going beyond the things written when you condemn people who celebrate Christmas or birthdays. You don't have good reasons. You're going to point to Herod's birthday? I'll point to Jesus. I think there's more weight to the account in Luke 2 than Mark 6. And nobody I know is celebrating Christmas and bringing in all these other potential or actual pagan ideas, non-Christian practices. Even if Christians use the date of the sun god or a non-Christian celebration, December 25th, are we not supposed to bring every thought and make it captive to the Christ? What's wrong with taking something bad and saying, you know what, instead, if that's the day you want to do that and you don't want to do that anymore because you know now it's wrong and Jesus is the Messiah, all these texts, stuff that's going on, well, then let's just use that day and celebrate his birth. I really don't see a problem with that. You may. Maybe there is. Guess what? You're not supposed to be judging people about it. You can choose. Do whatever you want to. Show people the texts. Let them choose. Do not be showing favor of the one against the other if it goes beyond the things written. You don't have any texts. You do not have any texts that speak directly against the celebration of birthdays. You do not have any texts that speak directly against the celebration of any days. You have texts like Colossians 2 and Romans 14 that we'll get to next, after a little bit more in 1 Corinthians, that say you're not supposed to be judging people over those things. So what does that tell you? It tells me that somehow people are getting us to see what's not in these texts. And that's why we spend our time whenever we can going through them together. And I appreciate it. I'm glad you're all with me. Let's go to the next. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's good stuff. Looks like you guys are enjoying the chat as well. I'll try to get to our text readings and day texts, or just text readings now. They used to be day texts. This coming week, I've been so busy with work and other things. A lot of good things happening. I'm going to be doing some more work-related videos soon, so I've been preparing for that. But I'm staying regular with at least the weekly show. I will be doing the text readings again soon. A lot of other things happening. Stay tuned. 1 Corinthians 10, 23 through 33. All right, let's listen to what he says. This is very important. It all is, I know, but in terms of sequence and how things are starting to develop around the text we've read, listen to this. All things are lawful. Now, I will interject here, you Trinitarians who like to use all things, like in Colossians 1, about all things being made through him, or John 1, even though contextually I believe you can show those are context specific, as all things often is. What are you going to say about this, right? All things is often said in a way that doesn't mean all things, but that is context specific, right? Obviously, criminal behavior and things against the law aren't what he's calling lawful here. But if you're not careful and you follow certain modes of logic, like I just referenced, you could end up taking what a text explicitly says and not seeing it. So I wanted to bring that up, because this is one of the instances where all things is used and clearly does not mean all things, and you have to understand the context. Or at least not exclude the things that would so obviously be considered unlawful. All things are lawful, but not all things are advantageous. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let each one keep seeking, not his own advantage, but that of the other person. It's kind of like the golden rule. It's not quite the golden rule, but it's consistent with it. Right? If you're looking out for the other person's advantage, the way you want them to look out for yours, that's a good thing. That works. Okay, now he gets more specific, right? Context specific. Everything that is sold in a meat market, keep eating. Make no inquiry on account of your conscience. Right? So we just read earlier how you're not supposed to be judged over eating or drinking. This was a big issue, right? Because there were certain things according to the law you can't eat or drink. And for example, blood. And so here he talks about the issue again, says everything in a meat market, keep eating. Don't ask about it. Okay? Why? Why don't ask about it? Because to Jehovah belong the earth and that which fills it. Right? So every single thing really is from Jehovah. And if that's how you see it, it's a good thing. Verse 27, if any one of the unbelievers, okay, that's very important to keep in mind. So, because he makes it clear, right? We're talking about a non-Christian here, unbeliever. And he's writing to believers. If any one of the unbelievers invites you and you wish to go, that is, to a meat market, proceed to eat everything that is set before you, making no inquiry on account of your conscience. So, unbeliever invites you to go out to eat. You go to a place to eat, don't ask about it. So he's showing here by example that how common it was at times. And even in Acts, it refers to people who held festivals and games as sort of being friendly toward Paul. That's why they wouldn't let him go into the theater when the people were being hostile or ready to be hostile to him. Because of all the silversmiths of Artemis. But here, so he's familiar with that, right, Paul? And he's not unaware that you're gonna have relationships with others. And you may even have to go places with them. And if you go, he says, eat everything. Don't even worry about it. Don't ask about it. But, verse 28, if the person you're with or if anyone says to you, this is something offered in sacrifice. So they specifically say, here's some food. It's been offered to Artemis or Baal. Here, for you. What does Paul say? Do not eat on account of the one that disclosed it, on account of conscience. He says conscience, not your own, but that of the other person. For why should it be that my freedom is judged by another person's conscience? That is so key, right? Let's break it down a little further, though. He says here, if someone tells you this is offered, don't eat it. Offered to, a god you don't worship, or offered in sacrifice to a false god. Don't eat it, not because it will offend you, right? But on account of the one that disclosed it, right? Conscience, I say, not your own, that of the other person. So what is he saying? The one who's at the meat market, who's serving in the meat market, who's giving you the meat offered in sacrifice to a false god, don't eat it for that person's conscience. You understand? You can still eat it. Why? Right here. And here. But the reason you would not do it here is because of the person giving it to you. It's not that your conscience is at issue. You can do it because of here. But if you don't eat it because of what they tell you about it being offered to a false god, that person will start to think about it. That's how you can bear witness. Sometimes just by taking a position on something, not because you can't eat it, but because by not eating it for the reason that was disclosed, it will make the person disclosing it think about it. And that's how they could become a believer, right? Because who are we talking about? Unbelievers. And so that's why he goes on to say, let's read a couple more verses. If I am partaking with thanks, why am I being spoken of abusively over that which I gave thanks? It's not you or me that's the problem or the concern. It's the other person that doesn't believe. You understand now why I say so often Christians shouldn't argue with other Christians? We should be looking for people who don't believe and trying to help them understand what's going on. And if they don't want it, fine. We're not here to overly burden people, but if they need it or want it, or if we're in a position like this, even if we want to eat it, we see an opportunity, person said it thinking they're going to help us appreciate this God, and instead we get them to appreciate our God just by not doing something, even though we can do it. That's how important it is not to judge others, because no one else will know if that's why you're doing it or not doing it. You see, circumcision of the heart. Only Yahuwah knows that and what's really going on inside our hearts and in all circumstances and conditions. If we go around judging other people, we could disrupt that kind of process, right? Where people might be able to eat because of their own conscience and the fact that to Yahuwah belongs the earth and that which fills it. All things are lawful in this context of what is eaten. And even it says in Mark that in the accounts of Jesus' life and teachings that he declared all foods clean. And later on we do read in Acts that they should avoid eating certain things because of the prohibitions of the law. And the number of Gentiles and Jews coming into contact with Christianity and having this understanding and awareness read every Sabbath day so that they weren't stumbled away from the Christ. Nothing beneficial was going to happen from not maintaining those prohibitions anyway. The only reason they're an issue today is not because people want to eat blood and things strangled. People are pretty clear on the benefits or lack thereof, I should say, of that. It's the use of blood as blood, medical use of blood, not as a food, but as blood, as actual blood in a person, not as food in the mouth digested. So that's where the issue is today with people and the apostolic decree. Not that they forbid certain things that made sense at the time. They still make sense in most people's mind. It's the way they've come to not make sense. That's a problem in most people's mind. So as Paul says, if I'm partaking with thanks, why am I being spoken of abusively? Verse 31, therefore, whether you're eating or drinking or doing anything else, do all things. Eating, drinking, or anything else. Trinitarians, John 1:1, Colossians 1, 1 Corinthians 10:31. Anything else, all things. It's context specific, right? So if it says he's the firstborn, it obviously doesn't include him. It's everything else. That's all things made through him after he was made as the firstborn. John 1:3, Genesis 1. Context specific, all physical things. The use of all things in other texts as well. Such as Psalm 2, right? You subjected all things, or Psalm 8, all things below his feet. That has to do with the physical things. Context specific. You have to keep that in mind, right? All things are lawful. Everything that is sold in the meat market, keep eating. That one's probably not quite the same as what I'm referring to, but here, we know he's not talking about criminal activity and obviously unlawful things. He's talking about things having to do with what fills the earth and belongs to Yahuwah that we can eat. Even if it's offered in sacrifice, it's not our problem. But we might be able to use it to help people who don't see. Either way, as the apostolic decree was formulated to assist with, keep from becoming causes of stumbling to Jews as well as Greeks into the congregation of God. So, right, obviously, if it's going to stumble a Jew who follows the law, are you going to eat or drink blood? No, that would be in total violation, even if you thought it was okay, even if it is okay because of this. Right? Wouldn't it not be okay because of this? So we're not here to make a point about what we can or can't do. We already know that. All things are lawful. They're just not all advantageous. They're just not all building up. We're supposed to be looking out for others, not ourselves. We're not supposed to be making it harder for people to fulfill the law of the Christ by giving them a law like the Mosaic law. Don't do this, do that, celebrate this, don't celebrate that. We're not supposed to be judging anyone about those things. Keep from becoming causes of stumbling. Don't judge them over that. Whether you're eating or drinking or doing anything else, do it for God's glory. Why are we trying to justify a human or a human teaching or a group's teaching? If it's not for God's glory, it's for nothing. Believe me. So if not doing something is going to keep from being a cause from stumbling, let's don't do it. If doing something is going to keep from being a cause of stumbling, do it. Even as I am pleasing all people in all things. There's that word again, or phrase. All things. Right? If you don't interpret it by the context, what will you think? Anything, I guess. It can't happen. So be careful. Even as I am pleasing all people in all things. We know that's not true, right? We know he was not pleasing to pedo or homo, right? He had to coexist with homo, pedo. Romans and Greeks were very much into that practice, but he didn't teach it, right? Just because people are allowed to do things doesn't mean we have to promote them, right? Just because it's legal for people to smoke cigarettes, does it mean I have to like it? I have to promote it? No. Same with other abusive practices. People can abuse themselves sexually. That doesn't mean I'm going to please them in that way. Context specific, everybody. All right, we know it's not including any form of abuse. And if your rear end is getting stitched up after sex, you've been abused. Sorry. All right, that's a sign. Hopefully you never have to see it. But I don't, if we've talked about it. And so it's just an example. Paul talks about it too. And it's in this context important to bring up because no, we're not supposed to be pleasing in every way, including abusive practices. We know that. It's talking about in every way that would be consistent with how we're made. Even if we don't like it necessarily in terms of something we might partake in. Not seeking my own advantage, but that of the many. You're not benefiting other people through the abusive sexual practices involved in homo or pedo. That's a fact. It's not debatable. They may have their own pleasurable experience with it, but it's taking years off their life, damaging their bodies. Fact. Same with cigarettes. You can do it. You can like it. I'm not here to impose my will against either one or anyone. But I'm not here to make everyone feel like what they're doing is the right thing either. That's not the goal. The goal isn't to make everyone feel great or even good about a bad practice. The goal isn't to be so accommodating that people don't think anything's bad, right? That's kind of our problem right now. No one's willing to step up and say, no, that's allowed, but it's bad. Yes, homosexuality is allowed. It's legal. It's just bad for you. How bad? It's really bad for you. It's like the worst relationship you could have as a human being outside of bestiality. It's that bad. Yes. No, you can't reproduce. You will be physically damaged and otherwise. Many writings on the subject, or just take an anatomy class. Sorry if you're into that practice. So these are not hidden facts. We have to be aware of these things and still try to help other people. But it's not about just making you feel so good you can keep abusing yourself or abusing other people. You can if you want to. I don't have to do it. Just like I don't have to celebrate other days, right? I don't have to be a part of Gay Pride Parade. But I'm not going to go stop them, right? I'm not going to say that people involved in Gay Pride Day or Gay Pride Parades can never change and are always bad. No, that would be judging them incorrectly. If I had to work with a gay person, I've worked with many, I would do so. I would treat them exactly the way I would want to be treated, just like I always have. Now, they've discriminated against me, not all of them. Many times, though, I thought they didn't or wouldn't, and they did. Either way, the fact is, once some gays find out you're a Christian, they inherently think you're against them, when really we're just against abuse. We're not against them, right? No more than I'd be against a cigarette smoker, because they and others choose to do things they think are not healthy for them. Not exactly the same as, for example, homo. But I'm using it as an example, right? We're not here to please everyone in every respect. Even though that's exactly what the text says. Pleasing all people in all things, right? Context specific. And we just read it. Whether you're eating, drinking, or doing anything else, it has to be for God's glory. It's not for God's glory if you're anally damaging one of his images, okay? If it's for homosex, or if you're two lesbos, female homos, you know that's not how you're made. You don't have the natural things that are satisfying in the stimulative way that two people, male and female, are aroused in order to reproduce. Right? It's very clear through any study of anatomy, any texts that are accepted and used that show female and male and how we're designed. Okay? So there's no glory to God in things that openly damage other people. But they can still do them. We're not here to shut down their parades, shut down their days. And as Christians, are we here to make it hard for other people to worship God the right way? Right? We're not going to judge homos for gay pride parade, right? I mean, most Christians I know don't do that. Some may, I guess, if they're like, they speak out against it in ways. I wouldn't do that, right? If people want to do that, they're allowed to do it. That doesn't mean I have to promote it or like it or do it. Why would it? It's actually vain of homos to think that heteros would in any way be desirous of being homo just because we allow them to be, right? We're hetero. You want to do that, fine. Just because we don't do it doesn't mean we don't like you. We just don't do what you do. You know, kind of like you and not doing what we do. It's like, see, they can't apply the golden rule. They're using a different standard that's not fair, and we have to be careful because sometimes that is happening in life. Whether it's homos or others, if they're not following a Christian path, then we could find ourselves like with one of these unbelievers in a place where they're doing things, and even though we may feel okay doing them, you know, to what extent are we going to do or not do something for the sake of the other person? Well, according to Paul, you know, we should try. It says right here in 1 Corinthians 10 that if an unbeliever invites you somewhere and you're eating and someone gives you something offered to a false god or offering sacrifice that way, it's not about how you feel. You're okay because if you're a Christian, you already accept that everything's from Jehovah. You should be beyond that. They're the ones who need your help. And that's what you should be looking at. How much more for your brother? Okay, so if we'll do that for people like in 1 Corinthians 10, unbelievers, or if like I was talking about with homos and others, they do their parades and things where they kind of glorify what we consider abuse. But we don't stop them, right? Well, what about people who believe like we do? Seems to me we're getting in the way or trying to stop more people who believe like we do than we do people who don't. Romans 14, let's go. Romans 14, this is our last section of texts. I'll take a look at your questions. We'll wrap it up. Romans 14. Let's take a look here. We're going to read pretty much the whole chapter of Romans 14. So much going on here, though. So get yourselves ready. Romans 14. We're going to end with this. Give you a second to get there and take a look at the comments. Okay, I think I've touched on a few of these things. Everett Commodore wants to talk about celebratory customs. I think in general I've touched on a lot of that, right? Eating or drinking or anything else. Not to be judging over a new moon, a Sabbath, or festival. And in 1 Corinthians 10, what did we find? That even if you're with an unbeliever in a place that's giving you food offered to another god or in sacrifice to something else than Jehovah or in honor of Jesus, that you're not the problem. That doing or not doing in that context really depends on the benefit to the other person. And I would say the same thing is true for any other customs, is what's going to be best in that context for helping the other person, right? Think not of yourself, but the other person. And if that means doing something you wouldn't normally do, as long as it's going to help that person respect and honor Jehovah more, I would say do it. That's up to you to choose. I don't know what it is. It's context specific, right? Sometimes we're faced with things we have to choose, and we look at it and we think, well, I don't want to do that because of how I view it, but it might upset that person so much about the things I want them to know. What should I do? So I would say you err on the side of what's going to be better for that person. to come to know the truth or what's right about Jehovah. That's the best advice I can give there, other than the specific accounts and texts we've read. That includes Romans 14, which is next. Let's check this out. Listen to this. Okay, now there'll be several times I'm going to use Lord here in place of the divine name, because I believe the NWT has gone a little too far here. Little too many uses of the divine name, even though, of course, see, the divine name is not a bad thing, right? It's very important, obviously. But the extent to which the NWT went in using it has made it come up negatively in discussions about these texts. And there was no reason to do that. It should have been based on a clear principle. And that principle should have been Old Testament quotations and clear references that would fit the use of the text in the New Testament. All right, that aside for now, but that's going to happen several times here. Romans 14:1. Okay, take everything we've read to this point and let's look at that together with this. Welcome the man having weaknesses in his faith, but not to make decisions on inward questionings. You're not supposed to do it. I'm not supposed to do it. 3 things. Inward questionings. Confession of Jehovah as the one God the Father, and Jesus is the Messiah sent for Savior. That's a public declaration, right? Golden rule shows the fruitage of the Spirit. We are not to make decisions for other people on inward questions. Right here. I know it's hard. Right? We don't think other people can do it sometimes. They can. We could. When other people didn't think we could, we did. And they can too. That doesn't mean we don't help where it's needed. It's just it's not needed as much as we might think. And we might not be helping as often as we think we are. We're not supposed to do certain things. Don't make questions or decisions on inward questions for other people. One man or person has faith to eat everything. But the man who is weak eats only vegetables, right? So there's not going to be any blood there for sure. Either way, that point aside, my point is he gives 2 types. They're not the same. We're not all the same. We're not supposed to be thinking less or better of each other over what we eat, over what we drink, or over anything. Context specific, of course. But so I would say, of course, we do make decisions in terms of things we'll do or people we'll be with based on what we want to be involved with, right? Or the consequences we want to have. So we make those kinds of decisions for ourselves. We may try to help others, see what's happening. But everyone must choose. And that's a broad spectrum of things. Everything involving eating, drinking. We can look at the prohibition of blood in light of certain things, but I mean, there's several times here in the context of eating and drinking, and then, of course, with Jesus and his declaration of all foods clean. Quite honestly, I don't think we should be getting involved with anybody over anything involving what's eaten or drink. Nothing. If they can't tell from the text, right? If the text and acts aren't enough to convince someone not to eat blood as a food, together with the law, without imposing the law on any one person, then let them choose. Let them go. Let them decide. Don't eat with them. Eat with them when they're not eating something like that, or just don't be involved, right? Not being involved with someone because they choose something differently doesn't mean we then make such defined distinctions that we make that person look less than us because they choose to eat or drink or celebrate something differently. We're not supposed to. It's between them and Jehovah. Romans 14. 3. Let the one eating not look down on the one not eating. Like I just said. And let the one not eating not judge the one eating. Like we just read. For God has welcomed that one. That is very important that we read. Because if God is welcoming these people who eat differently and drink differently and do things differently than us, we better have a very good reason. I mean, the highest right? For excluding them from association? Who are you to judge the house servant of another? Verse 4. To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, not because we're there, because we're no comfort at all. Sometimes we can be, and we should be. We should try. But in this context, it's Jehovah who makes a person stand. We're not there in the inner decisions of their mind and heart that show who they really are. We can help to an extent. We can try where it's important to show love, where people want our assistance. Otherwise, to each person their own and between them and their own master they stand or fall. It's right here. One man judges one day as above another. You think that day is more important than this day. You celebrate this day, I celebrate that day. Another man judges one day as all others. Every day is the same. Every day is Christmas. Right? Sometimes as witnesses we used to say, or I say, and can be the case, right? If you're celebrating Jesus' birth on December 25th, that can be one day to do it. Right? When you have time, the world is kind of geared around that. It's more convenient in some ways, work-wise. Not everyone's always together. Or you can just celebrate it every day, right? And by the way you act, the way you are. That's what he's saying right here. Some people put a day, one day, above others. Right here. Another judges one day the same as every day. So he's basically, without knowing it, referring to the Watchtower people who say, I celebrate Christmas every day. One day as all days. And to people who celebrate holidays, like Christmas, Thanksgiving, just days, right? Doesn't specify against any days not to celebrate. Only days we're not to judge people over celebrating. One person judges a day as above another. Well, how's a day above another? By being celebrated specially as a holiday. Right? Is that not what a holiday is? Putting a day above another day? Right here, he says you're not supposed to judge people who do that. Verse 6, he who observes the day observes it to the Lord. Also, he who eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who does not eat to the Lord, and yet gives thanks to God. None of us, in fact, lives with regard to himself only, and no one dies with regard to himself only. For both if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. Therefore, both if we live and if we die, we belong to the Lord. For to this end Christ died and came to life again, that he might be Lord over both the dead and the living. We're not that Lord. We don't have that kind of, even though we have authority, we don't have this authority that in this context involves days that people put above another or treat the same as all others, or about what they eat, because it's between them and whom? You and me? No. It's between them and God. Right? We don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. We die to the Lord, God, and the Messiah, the one he appointed as Lord of the congregation. So with that whole buildup right here, talking about days being above another or being the same as all, and not looking down on the one eating or the one not eating, that whole buildup, how that person does it to God or to the Lord, how Christ came, died, and came to life again so he could be the Lord. All of that is a buildup to this. Why do you judge your brother? Why do you also look down on your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says Jehovah. This is okay to use the divine name here. To me every knee will bend down, and every tongue will make open acknowledgement to God. Different from the quotation or use of the same language in Philippians 2, as originally used in Isaiah, which of course says nothing about doing something to someone to the glory of another God. So then, each of us will render an account for him or herself to God. That's it. If you're not helping out, if you're not helping someone else with their account, leave them alone. You got to have to worry about your own account enough. Yet we're running around and judging people based on the days they're celebrating, the foods they're eating or not eating, the use of blood, all this stuff. Making divisions, dividing, taking up all of our time. We're supposed to be getting ready to render an account to God, not to each other. So why are we questioning what other people do? We're only really supposed to be making those kinds of questions when it comes to people like in 1 Corinthians 10, whom we can help by the decisions we make or don't make. We've already gotten to the point where we accept and can accept that all things are lawful. But we have to be ready to do what needs to be done in order not to stumble anyone and to reach others. We have to render an account to God. If we're not making that process easier, we're in trouble. Romans 14:13. Therefore, let us not be judging one another any longer, but rather make this your decision not to put before a brother a stumbling block or a cause for tripping. I know and I'm persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing, context specific, nothing is defiled in itself. Only where a man considers something to be defiled, to him it is defiled. Think of that. Remember, he said we're not to make decisions on inward questions for people. Here, he says nothing is defiled except where a person considers it defiled. Well, you don't think for someone else. I don't think for you, and you don't think for me. So how could I make decisions about what's defiled for you? Because it's not defiled in that sense objectively. In this sense, what's defiled is subjective, right? It's based on how you see it. The thing itself is the same, right? Food. But if you view it, like your perspective, or even as your subjective view, if you look at it as something that's bad and someone else looks at it as something good, it's bad for you and good for them, according to these texts. So if that's the case, how can you possibly judge what's good for someone else? You can't. So we're not supposed to be making decisions about what to eat, what to celebrate, what days to observe, and those who do are in direct violation of these texts. What does that tell you? Verse 15. For if because of food your brother is being grieved, you are no longer walking in accord with love. If you're putting what you eat or foods, if you're making that the issue, you're not in touch. You're not in love. Do not by your food ruin that one for whom Christ died. It's not for you. It's not for me. It's for him. Do not therefore let the good you people do be spoken of with injury to you. For the kingdom of God does not mean eating and drinking, but means righteousness and peace and joy with Holy Spirit. For he who in this regard slaves for Christ is acceptable to God and has approval with men. This is how we get along with people. By not judging them. Right? Not criminals, right? They're never going to like us. We're not talking about them. We're talking about people who just like to do things that aren't criminal, right? Or that aren't so abusive to other people you can't follow the golden rule. Among those people, this is how you should be acting. And everybody else, right? We're not supposed to be judging with respect to days or eating or drinking with respect to anyone. We're just supposed to make the best decision where it concerns the other person. Verse 19, so then let us pursue the things making for peace and the things that are upbuilding to one another. Is that happening or not? Is your association with people, whether it's on boards, on this channel, anywhere, are you upbuilding or not? Now, you can be upbuilt in a religion that teaches a whole bunch of false stuff, right? I mean, it's just happy being there and make you feel good. Fine. We're not talking about that, though, right? We're talking about peace of mind and the works of God, where we're not misled. Are you upbuilt apart from it as a part of that, whatever it is you're doing? If so, stop tearing down the work of God just because of food. Don't let that be the issue. And food in the context of eating or drinking or anything else. True, all things are clean. Context specific, right? We've read that several times. I've referenced several other texts, and it's true all over the place. No more so than here. True, all things are clean. Right? But we also know that there's a form of sex that is unclean. Does not Paul teach us that, the very one who's writing this? But it is injurious to the man who with an occasion for stumbling eats. All right, so back to the whole, how do you view it in that setting? Right? What are you trying to accomplish? Is this someone who's offering it to you and whom, while you can eat it because of how you view it, you're going to say or do something to help them think about it? All things are clean, but what are you going to do when it comes to the occasion? Stumble someone or not? It is well not to eat flesh or to drink wine or do anything over which your brother stumbles. That makes sense, right? Would we just willingly want to do something if we know it's going to bother someone? Maybe they shouldn't be making us feel bad about it. Maybe they're being too rigid and kind of like the Pharisees and scribes and just like against what Paul's saying, right? They're being too concerned with eating and drinking, judging other people. Well, if they're new and if it's going to help them, what are we going to do? It's up to you. It's up to me. We got to choose the right thing for the other person. That's for sure. As hard as it may be. Doesn't mean you can't eat or drink or do whatever it is you choose not to do if that's the decision that's best for the other person. It's just a question of what are you going to do on that occasion. The faith that you have it in accord with yourself in the sight of God. Happy is the man that does not put himself on judgment by what he approves. Even if you approve of it and can do it and your conscience is fine about it, don't go running around promoting it and making it seem like it's okay for everyone else to do. Maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe it's bad for them. Are you sure you want to be put on judgment because of what you promote among other people, even if you do it? Think about it if that's the case with you. Don't put yourself on judgment by what you approve. Be cautious. Be discreet. Use the occasion to benefit and upbuild the faith of the other person. You should be fine. Think of them. How are they going to react this time? But if he has doubts, he is already condemned if he eats. How you see it is critical. If it's going to bother you, if it's a sin in your mind, if you're going to eat or do that thing or celebrate that day, don't do it. If celebrating Christmas on December 25th or any day as Christmas, a birthday of any kind, if that bothers you, don't do it. And you're fine. You're not condemned by doing something you don't think is right. Here's the key. Don't condemn other people either, if they choose to do it. Remember what I said earlier about smoking. Just because two people may smoke and I don't smoke cigarettes, it doesn't mean I dislike them or wouldn't associate with them. It just means there's something they do that I don't do or that I don't do that they do. And it's very important for me not to think less of them, but to only consider what I want to do or what's good to do if it's going to be beneficial to them. That's how you should view it. If it's going to bother you, don't do it. But if it's going to help them, even if it does bother you, well, maybe you should think about it. Depends on your faith in the situation, right? We just read. Indeed, everything not out of faith is sin. Do all things for God's glory. We, though, who are strong, ought to bear the weaknesses of those who are not strong and not be pleasing ourselves. Golden rule, consistent with it. And it makes sense, right? If we've already learned, we've been through these things, we know it's hard for other people. That's the whole point of the Acts 5 and later in Acts, the apostolic decree. I think it's Acts 15 and later in Acts 20, where the apostles provide decrees. Right? We're trying to help other people in ways that may not be exactly what we would otherwise want to do. And if helping people understand that we're not going to do certain things because of the way they've come to think of those things is customarily wrong, like Everett Commodore's question, right? So the Jews and Gentiles in the accounts in Acts, where they were encountering the Christians, but also familiar with the Jews and the readings of Moses on the Sabbaths, and not to eat blood, what are they supposed to do? Can they still eat blood? Does that still apply? Well, to me, those accounts, those decrees seem like ways of looking out for the other people, right? The apostles, the others were strong. I mean, you could read Paul right there. What is he saying? You can go ahead and eat. But he's also aware of the other person. I think it's the same thing with the apostolic decree, right? They're thinking of these other people who haven't yet become believers, just like in 1 Corinthians 10. How do we help them become believers? All right, fine. We'll make this decree that captions a few of these basic things that don't help people anyway and only hurt. And that way they won't have such a hard time leaving behind the law that they keep hearing about just because we're telling them it's been fulfilled in Christ. Same thing. Bearing the weaknesses of those who are not strong, going out of our way to do things that we might not otherwise feel we have to do if it's going to help them. If it's going to please our neighbor and be what is good for upbuilding. Right? Because even Christ died, it says Christ did not please himself, it says, just as it is written, the reproaches of those who were reproaching you have fallen upon me. So he didn't always take the easy way out, right? He even did things he didn't want to do because he knew he had to do it in order to accomplish what was set in motion in Genesis 3. And so because for that reason, love for his Father and humanity, he did what he didn't want to do. And so if we're going to follow someone who did what he didn't want to do for the sake of other people, what does that tell you? What does it tell you if we follow somebody who was willing to do things he didn't want to do because he knew it would make people he cared most about happy? That it would help them most, and ultimately he'd be okay. That's what we should do. If we're following that one, right, that's who we claim to be, Christians, then for sure we should not be doing everything we want and making it more difficult for other people to do what they want. Instead, we should go out of our way to do everything we can to follow what we conscientiously believe is true, but to even give in there if we have to, if it's for the sake of somebody else who hasn't yet come to believe. That's the most important thing. We already believe. So it's surely not the most important thing that we break down another Christian's faith, right? Or that we confuse ourselves over what to believe, what days to celebrate, what things to see as worth eating or not eating. Is it that important? Or isn't it easier, and even more important in light of those texts, that we empower other people by showing them the information that we've come to accept, so that when they read it, they can be convinced just like you and I have become convinced. And if they need a little more convincing, then let's make sure we convince them by what we do next.